Start recording now.
All right, we're live right now.
Bro, we're recording.
Hey guys.
All right.
Hey, Matt.
So
Hey, Turk.
Hey, Turk.
Everybody, this is Turk right here.
The goat dog.
No,
he's only got
we're Turkish.
here.
Turkish delights.
You see this nub? It's gonna move. He's gonna get excited. It's gonna move.
That nub moves. I'm ending this call.
Yeah, I have a thing about nubs.
It's true.
Hey, to start off the call, can you talk about why your dog's named Turk?
I have no idea why his name is Turk.
Cool.
We adopted him and his name was already Turk, so.
This call has been brought to you by Murder of Pros.
Yeah,
like, share, subscribe. We're out.
That's a riveting story, man. I appreciate it.
It usually pulls some heartstrings.
I want to donate to the ASPCA right now because of that story.
I don't even know what that stands for.
It's like American. It's got to be animal or American at first.
American.
It could be antelope.
Something protective cruelty to animals. The
Like,
American Society for Protecting Cruelty to Animals.
Or protect the cruelty of animal. I don't know. We're gonna edit this out.
No, we're not. Cool.
So how do you peak, man?
Yeah, let's jump right into it. The goal here is, I guess, to talk about peaking, to bounce some ideas off each other around, I guess, what a peak is, why it matters, and then how we approach it. I think, generally speaking, the three of us agree that peaking is a real thing, right? Like, You can be in shape to compete, but we probably have different strategies around how to get someone in shape to be at their best. So I guess maybe let's open it up, like, why peaking matters and, like, what the difference really is.
We'll take the floor on that one.
Sean, let's talk about your, I guess, how much weight you put on peaking. Because I think actually you probably have maybe the lowest weight of, like, peaking as it pertains to, like, meet day, right?
Yeah. I mean, like, I don't really put too much emphasis on the peak. I generally think that, like, 2 to 3 weeks is generally good enough for a peak. I have learned recently that I probably need to shorten that up a little bit. But yeah, generally speaking, like, it's just a really good way for people to realize their potential and build a little bit of confidence before all of the overtraining starts to encompass the athlete in the last week of training. Usually I use it as a way to hit some PRs that we can hopefully open up with, like, a PR triple or something like that, and set some openers, and also see what the athlete is capable of as they start to super compensate or whatnot.
Cool.
And now, because I don't know anything about powerlifting, can you explain what super compensation is?
Oh, yeah. I mean, so super compensation is basically the idea that in order for the athlete to be the freshest they possibly can on game day, they need to overtrain themselves functionally. So there's two parts of overtraining. There's one part of overtraining where it's functional, where basically it serves a purpose for recovery and then super compensation. And then there's another part of overtraining that we as coaches try to avoid as much as possible, and that is non-functional overtraining or non-functional overreach. And non-functional basically just means your coach never gave you a deload, your numbers are sliding, and it's time to fire your coach and hire Matt Cronin.
Okay.
So when an athlete overreaches functionally, the idea here is that they have gotten so much fatigue and so much stress to their central nervous system or CNS that by the time the deload occurs on the last week of training, after the athlete potentially hits their singles or not, the athlete then rests and then sees a super compensation where they're able to get anywhere between, like, 5 to 10%. As per Greg Knuckles, I guess, 5 to 10% off of their current numbers, ideally.
Okay. Very textbook, Sean.
Hey, man, I'm nothing but textbook.
Matt, what's your take? I guess both. What is super compensation? What does it mean for a peak? And, like, why does that matter?
I think in simplest terms, super compensation is the art of, I don't want to say art, the science of incurring fatigue so that performance drops. And then by the time that you recover from that fatigue, you'll have, at that point, you will be a better athlete. You'll be stronger than you were before you induced all that fatigue because you induced it and then you adapted from it. So that's kind of the way that I like to explain supercompensation and think about it. And the other question was, what is a peak, or what's the importance of a peak?
Bit of both.
So essentially the way I like to think about peaking is that I'm trying to create one day where we have an environment where our fitness is the absolute highest that it can possibly be, and our fatigue is the absolute highest, or I'm sorry, fatigue is the absolute lowest that it can possibly be. Now, if fatigue dips too much, then you'll probably have a performance drop and you'll detrain a little bit. And then there's obviously the vice versa. You can come in a little bit fatigued and not perform the way you want to. So it's kind of a science, but it's not always exact. And I think that's why there's a lot to kind of talk about when it comes to peaking.
Cool. And then just to maybe demystify any words, when we say fitness, we specifically mean a person's strength. And
Yes.
when we talk about fatigue, we mean the accumulated stress from training, right? So we're trying to give an athlete enough training stress that they can maintain strength, but not so much that it maintains stress. So in other words, you feel fresh, but you haven't done such little training that you roll back some of the strength gains.
Yes. There's obviously diminishing returns on both ends.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So a peak, then, what we're trying to do is we want to make sure that, because we're athletes and we have an event, and that event is a meet, we want to know that of all days in a training cycle, we are at our best on meet day, right? We wouldn't necessarily want to be at our best in a training cycle. We don't want to be at our best the week after the meet, right? So I guess my question is, like, when we're peaking an athlete, is it necessary that we only peak before a meet? Or put another way, what's the difference between a peak where a person touches triples and doubles and realizes strength versus like a regular deload? So someone's doing like a 5s block, 6s, and then we just give them like a light week, right? Isn't that kind of the same thing with regards to fatigue management?
Yes, but I don't think that the like readiness for the type of intensity that you're going to be doing is there. Now, I think one thing that I think a lot of people kind of get mixed up on with like a peak is that it's like it's like a peak block is its own block and it's different from a lot of other training. And I don't think that that's necessarily the case. I think peak is one day and that's it. And the rest of it is just training leading up to that. And then you have your tapering of volume and or intensity, depending on how you like to do it, to lead you to that day, which is competition day, which is where I would in turn like to peak you. So I think a lot of people kind of get into this mindset that like, all right, like we're 4 weeks out now, it's time to peak. And like, I'm going to start hitting all these like crazy heavy numbers and like, I'm going to drop all this volume and stuff like that. And I think that's kind of a reason why we're having this call. So I don't want to say anything kind of game changing, maybe prematurely, but I think that's like kind of a misconception about peaking is that it's kind of this big, like accumulated kind of just thing when it's really just the state that you're supposed to be in on one day versus like how your training gets dictated in terms of like a peak. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I personally think that the best way to describe a peak is that it is the number one most, ideally, number one most surefire day that we have an expectation to do really well, right? I think that that's the kind of like the way I kind of describe it to my athletes. Like, a lot of times, like, and all three of us have been in that same situation where an athlete's like, hey, I just had a deload. How come I'm not hitting PRs? And I'm like, no, you just had a deload because you were super stressed out and you got food poisoning last week. Like, you didn't get a deload in order for us to improve circumstances. You got a deload for us to manage a slide, right? And I guess in peaking, it's more of a situation where we're trying to we're trying to beat you up and trying to touch some heavy weights and grind through some stuff. And we do that all in the effort to make sure that on that specific day, it is the one day where you can almost expect something good to happen. And that's the day that's planned for in entire cycles.
I just realized that, like, I completely forgot to answer Nikhil's questions about deloads. he was like, yo, like, what's the difference?
Why is a peak not a deload?
A peak is not a deload because a deload is just to, in my head, when I give somebody a deload, it's just usually like Sean said today, and just reduce overall stress. Now, a taper and a deload are usually, they're kind of the same thing, but not always. The way that I approach like a taper going into a meet is that like, hey, I'm not just dropping all of this volume or intensity or anything so that you're super fresh immediately. You kind of want to, do it strategically and drop volume throughout the week, like the 1 to 2 weeks, usually depending on the person. The 1 to 2 weeks prior to competition, you want to slowly start to drop that volume. Some people like to do it a little bit faster and a higher drop off. Some people like to do it a little more gradually, and that's kind of just coach to coach. But a taper is like a very strategic, like, hey, we're going to get you to one day where you are absolutely money. And then after that day, you're going to be terrible. And before that day, you're probably not going to be absolute money. A deload is usually a pretty quick, like, 1 week or just a couple days of reduced just stress, whether that's, through intensity or volume or whatever it is. So in essence, like on paper, they are the same thing. You are reducing stress just so that you can have some fatigue start to drop off. But the way that I approach them is very, very different. And I'm sure, you two can say the same.
Cool. So when we talk about peaking for a meet, like I think we would all agree that as you raise average intensity, average volume tends to drop. And like, I'm going to define volume as tonnage. So weight times reps times sets, right? You can do more workload with a 5x5 at 80% than you would 4 triples at 90%, right? But there's a different adaptation to 4 triples. Like 90% work gets you more in shape for a 1RM than 80% work. But maybe 80% work has its own qualities that it develops, right?
Yes. Like if you give somebody 5x5 for weeks and weeks and weeks, and then you tell them, hey, do a 5x5 on Monday and then rest on Wednesday and then like max out on Friday, they're probably not going to like hit. To say that what they're not capable of is false because they weren't capable of that. But maybe if training had been kind of manipulated a little bit and made them a little more ready to do a 1RM, then they would have much bigger result. So I think that's kind of like an easy way to kind of explain what you're getting at.
Yeah. So I think that's important to note that like when we raise intensity, we necessarily will drop volume. But we raise intensity to basically realize the progress we've made. When we talk about peaking strategies, the reason we're doing this is that you guys have fairly different strategies. So Matt, you talked about a taper being a period of dropping volume. Yeah. And I think when we look at the way, Sean, you tend to like peak your athletes, there's a lot of triples and doubles in probably the last 2 to 3 weeks of training. Yeah. And then kind of a maintenance phase where we're hitting like enough volume to maintain fitness, but not necessarily enough volume to create new strength. Right. Whereas for Matt, it seems more like when you talk about it, you're doing, I would argue, just enough heavy work to get comfortable with heavy weight. But you're basically training as long as you can because you're not necessarily worried about realizing true strength until meet day. Is that fair to say?
Exactly.
Cool. So maybe we'll talk about rationales, pros and cons, right? So like Sean, I guess like your programming tends to look kind of classical block periodizations over a long enough period of time where you'll have kind of like a post-meet hypertrophy block. Right. Then people spend a lot of time in like that 6s rep range, and then they'll see triples probably for about 3 weeks before a meet, right? Like most people live on 4 to 6 reps of the competition lifts and close variations. So maybe when do you decide to start tapering down to triples? And are you planning any sort of like backfill the volume to maintain that fatigue?
Well, I think how my peaking looks now and how my peaking looked maybe like 6 months ago are a little different, mainly to kind of go into the backfill of volume. I think what I used to do in the past was essentially do triples because I'm very heavily RPE based, which I think all of us are pretty much. Essentially, what I like to do is at the start of a peaking block, my blocks are typically about 4 weeks long or so. At the start of it, I'll probably hit someone with triples at 6, 7, 8 with like 1 or 2 back offsets. And what I mean by back offsets is just like anywhere between 5 to 10% off of your top set. And then from there, I will then go into deducting anywhere between 1 to 3 reps week by week, and then increasing RPE. So by week 2, you're doing like 3 at 7, 3 at 8, 3 at 9, and then maybe 1 back offset with 10% off of your top set. And then that's kind of like what I use to kind of inform the opening situation, just because I always had that in my head where like you should open up with something that you can triple pretty easily. And so once I get there, usually that's about 2 weeks out from the meet. So right before the meet happens, or right before we hit openers and taper completely, during that 3rd week of the block, usually it'll be 2 at 7, 2 at 8, 2 at 9. The big change that I've made recently is that I will typically put more volume and less intensity on that 2nd week out from the meet. And truth be told, that has to do with essentially all 3 of us having conversations about peaking maybe like a couple of weeks ago. But basically, instead of 2 at 6, 2 at 7, 2 at 8, 2 at 9, what I felt was getting someone ready to hit a heavy weight. The benefit is that they're ready to hit heavy weight, but the detriment is that they might take on too much fatigue with that intensity. And so typically I'll do double at 6, 7, 8, still hit a pretty respectable heavy weight, then do a couple of back offsets from there. So usually where I would have went for an intensity approach 2 weeks out, I more so go for a volume backfill 2 weeks out. And then from there, once the athlete gets to their week out from their meet, I'll typically have them hit their openers or something lower than their openers based on their mentality and based on their experience level and based on their training age. And from there, they'll either work out 2 to 3 times on the peak week or the week prior to the end of the cycle. Or
that'll be meet week.
That'll be meet week, yeah. So usually it'll be like singles on Monday. Let's say if the meet is on Saturday, like singles on Monday, whether it be openers or not openers. And on that day, I might elect to do some back off percentage-based work from there. So, for example, a couple athletes leading into the competition that we're having this upcoming weekend, what I'm doing is basically a single at the opener that we discussed, and then doing squats at anywhere between 76 to 82% based on the athlete for like 9 to 10 reps or so. And then on bench, probably be anywhere between 9 to 12 reps or so. For back offsets, that'll be 78 to 82% because I think that we can all agree that we can push bench a little bit more as we get closer to the meet. And on deadlift, typically after that single, that's pretty much it.
Cool.
But yeah, that's like kind of hopefully showing a bit of a contrast to like what I was doing in the past to like now kind of more so going to like what we all kind of decided should be like the peaking way for MoC in general.
And so Matt, you have lifters competing Sunday at our meet too?
Yeah, I've got 3.
Cool. So like, what does meet week look like for them? Like maybe give me 2 examples, say your heaviest person, your lightest person.
So meet week for most people, I've got 2 girls and 1 guy doing it, and one of the girls and the guy are pretty new, so their case is going to be a little bit different, just because they can make more week-to-week progress. But I'll use the one girl, Elisa, that I have competing, and then I'm going to use, I would just say like a more, like in my head, I'll make up a guy who, you know, we'll say he squats twice a week, he benches 3 times a week, and he deadlifts like twice a week. So let's go with Elisa. She is doing really well with fair amounts of like rep work, especially with her bench. I'm actually going to pull up her program right now just to kind of really make sure I'm on target. But on like one of her bench days, I know I have her going as like high as 6 reps as of right now. And the reason I do this, and I know can be unconventional for some people in the way that they think, is just because when someone's making really great progress on a certain like dosage of volume or a certain dosage of intensity and like it just within a certain rep range, I don't want to take that away from them. I know Sean likes to call it striking a hot hand, and that's kind of exactly what we're doing there. She's doing really well on, one set thing. Let's not take that away from her, but instead what I would like to do is if we need to get ready for the meet, I'll introduce a little bit of like heavier work. Maybe it's a couple doubles or it's a single, depending on what day of the week it is. So she gets that practice with that heavier weight to kind of get her ready. But I know that as of right now, the rep range that I have her rocking in is like inducing the most stimulus and giving her just like the most return on her investment. She's making good progress doing what she's doing. So I just don't like to prematurely say like drop reps or increase rep range or anything like that, especially if someone's like making progress and doing well. So right now that's what she's doing. As we're coming up into this last week, I still have to write her final week. But I generally have kind of like a template of what I like to do for tapering for people. Very Mike Zordos kind of, descended or whatever. I like to keep frequency there for as close to normal as possible. So, say someone benches on like Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and they compete on Saturday, I'll probably have them bench like maybe like Tuesday, Thursday, and then have Saturday be the third bench day. And within their like training microcycle or what would be just a week of training, I'll make that Friday, that third bench day, like the heaviest day where the singles is there, just so it's really easy to taper into that last day. And I can kind of have a better predictor of like where they're going to be around based off of how they've been doing every single Friday. And then when I just kind of shift that back to Saturday, they should be good to go. But starting off, she'll probably squat and bench and deadlift. Let's say on like Tuesday, I'll have her do some like back off, probably triples, somewhere from like 3 to 5 triples on squat. Same thing. Usually for squat, I'm coasting around 85%. It's something that's a little tough, but what people can get through. And then later in the week, they'll have like less stressful stuff. Bench is usually I'll do like triples with like 82%. And then deadlift, I'll probably have her do like 1 to 3 singles, maybe one with the opener and then a couple with just like 80% or something like that. She's a conventional deadlifter that usually taxes people a little bit more. So going a little more kind of conservative on the dosage there. Roll into like the meets on Sunday. So roll into like Thursday, she'll bench again. She'll do like a single with her opener again and some doubles with right around like 85%. And then I'd have her go in the next day and probably hit somewhere between like 3 to 5 singles on bench with just like 87%. Now, with girls who don't bench like crazy absolute amounts of weights, even if like they're a good bencher in their own respective weight class, if they're not moving like massive amounts of just absolute weight, you can get away with having more in there for longer. And honestly, the fatigue drop off is really, really fast for those type of people. And if you kind of be a little too conservative, like just they'll kind of tank before meet day happens. So if anyone watching or listening is kind of wondering why maybe I have her going so heavy, so close, that's why. With the dude, I'd probably like a heavier dude who's a little bit stronger. I'd probably follow a similar kind of approach, but just kind of manipulate the intensities and the volumes a little bit. Maybe instead of doing like 5 triples with the squat at 85% on that first day, maybe it'll be like 3 triples with 85%, or maybe like 4 or 5, but just with like 80% or something like that. It's really hard to just say like this is what everybody does, because that's not really how I usually go about it. I like to look at the trends, and I like to put certain emphasis on certain days in the week. Like I said, like a Saturday, if someone's competing on a Saturday and they lift on a Saturday, I'll try to make that their heaviest training day of the week with like squatting, benching, and deadlifting. That way I can just see the trends. And if they're doing really, really well going into, every week into that Saturday, then I know I probably don't need to change all that much in that last week. If they're super fatigued and I'm seeing their performance drop off, I'll have to, taper that volume a little more aggressively. But another thing Mike Zordo said that I really love is just like tapering's it's a science, but it's not exact science. So long story long, keep frequency there, keep intensity there up until like just a few days out, 2 to 3 days out, and slowly kind of just make sure that volume is just dropping down, but keep them, ready for those heavy weights.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because, like, especially you're talking about a lifter 4 or 5 days out, squatting triples at 85%. That's like about an RPE 8-ish, right? It's like pretty intensive sets in terms of, like, you have to focus to get them in.
Yes.
I think someone who you were coaching last year probably would not have seen that, right? It would have been openers and rest.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest things that I've learned over the past year as I get like better and better athletes is basically, number one, the peak should be informed from deloads in the past, right? Like seeing how athletes react to deloads and how long they can be beat up for until they deload or ask for a deload or until a deload is implemented. And then, like, based on how they react on those rep schemes and on that schedule, use that as a framework to kind of time your peak or your peaking strategy. And to kind of Matt's point is that, like, peaking isn't the same for everybody. It also is something that is half subjective and half objective, in my personal opinion. I think that some athletes can handle a very large amount of work. So, for example, like Nikhil puts an almost malpractice amount of volume, or he does an almost malpractice amount of volume. It's out of textbook for me, but putting that amount of volume for him is what he needs to progress. And for me, for example, I tend to get beat up really easily. And so I tend to do a very large mixture of intensity and maybe some volume because I cannot handle that amount of volume, especially leading into like a competition or something like that. And Matt, I feel like you're kind of like in between where like you do very well in those like doubles and triples, but like we then run the risk of potentially peaking you too early or something like that. And in your case, you would need that volume to kind of support the driving of those 2 or 3 reps, right? So like it's just as much of an art as it is a science. I totally agree with that, for sure.
Yeah, I think it's really important to recognize just everything is situational. You have different athletes who, let's say if Sean was a week out from a meet and he was feeling really beat up and he's not doing super hot in his training, he's going to need a more aggressive taper to make sure that he gets ready. Now, and especially if he's someone who, I think this is a better case for, let's say, Nikhil. If Nikhil's a week out and he's super beat up, he's doing a lot of volume, it's probably safe to say that you can pull some of that volume out. Now, if someone's doing lower volume, if you only have them doing like doubles and triples a couple times a week, it's really hard to kind of know where the line is where like, hey, if we pull out X amount of volume, they're going to peak well off for that day, that competition day. But if we pull out any more than that, they're going to detrain, because if you're someone who's doing a low amount of volume and progressing, it's really hard to know if like, it's just hard to be safe when it comes to pulling out volume because you're doing so little to progress. Like, how do you know if pulling out 1 rep a week even is like going to make them start to detrain and regress at all? So that's just kind of like, Sean said, knowing your athlete. And that's why I like to treat each single week as like its own mini peak, and like that last day of the week be the heavier work, and just seeing how everything in that week kind of led to that last day. And now I can use that to, I can just look at the trends of their weeks and being like, hey, you were doing a ton of volume and you were still doing really well on that last day. So like, I don't want to pull too much out in meet week because maybe that's just the amount that you need to progress. I think that's where a lot of people get lost, is they go to textbook and they'll slash it out just because like they're doing 50 reps of bench a week or whatever it is. Like they have to be holding fatigue. They may not be. And I've seen people slash it because they think they can squeeze more out of the taper and then have like a bad bench day on meet day or any lift for that matter. So I think it's important to just like kind of ride that line and just really follow trends. History is just the best teller of, what to do moving forward.
Yeah. And I can speak to that for myself. Like I try my best not to be dogmatic in anything that I do in my coaching, but I gotta say that it's really tough not to be dogmatic about your peaking strategy, right? It's super tough to like,
especially when you only have an athlete 2 meets a year.
Right.
Like it's hard to be like, hey, we should train longer, because if you miss, right, it's almost better to at least lock in a gym PR, because people can like say, well, I PR'd somewhere, right, versus like almost pushing too hard, because then as a coach you could be like, shit,
because you're on the line.
24 weeks of training, and we only got 5 kilos on your total,
right. And obviously different variables affect the athlete's meet day performance. Like I tend to be a little bit more anxious on meet day than I normally am on my day-to-day training. And that has a huge effect on my performance at meets. And I think a lot of athletes, to a degree, like to point to the peak as like, hey, this is what messed up. But also, like, we need to consider like how mentally strong is that athlete, how experienced is that athlete. Did that athlete get what they wanted from a coach-athlete perspective, or is the athlete just upset because they didn't get what they personally wanted? It's a mixed bag. I personally think that peaking is one part, but also making sure that your athlete understands what we're doing, and also making sure that the athlete is bought into the peaking process, because we as coaches can have the best possible peak for the athlete, but if the athlete hates it, then they're going to start to think that this is not going to work for them. And it all boils down to coaching and athlete communication with the individual, rather than like being like, hey, like this will definitely work from a paper and textbook sense. Making sure that the athlete's confident in the program as much as you are, and also making sure you're taking into like meet day variables that you may have the insight about.
Yeah, I think there's a ton of especially recently, I've been thinking about it more. I think there's a ton that goes into meet day versus, and that probably goes without saying, ton that goes into meet day and how you do on meet day outside of just the peak. One thing that like I was just talking about with somebody today, I was like, if your training sessions aren't like absurd amounts of high volume, and you're taking like 4 hours to complete those training sessions, and then you go to a quick meet that you're done in 2.5 hours or 3 hours, like those people don't do so hot on meet day just because they're not like conditioned for that environment that moves that kind of fast. And like that was just one that I was just talking about today, and there's like 1,000 of them. So obviously having a lot of other things in check, if your athlete is doing well in that, and all those other outside factors, for the most part, you can be like, hey, when we taper you, if you're feeling really beat up right now, when we taper you, like you're going to be good to go. You're going to hit some PRs, yada, yada, yada. If somebody's like doing super well each week and is like PRing every week, you probably need to, an athlete may get a little ahead of themselves and be like, dude, like once we taper, I'm going to get like another 10 kilos out of this or whatever. And that may be just where like it comes down to coaches managing expectations and saying like, hey, I'm never going to say never, but at the same time, like you've been progressing week to week really, really great. You're telling me on like the days that you're hitting these new PRs, like you don't feel rocked, you don't feel fatigued. So like I don't think it's like safe to drop all this volume to try to squeeze out more when you look back at your last meet and like you hit whatever number and now you're hitting like sets of 3 and 4 with that number. You've made a ton of progress since then. You may just be someone who's not going to get so much out of the taper this time around, and you just got a lot out of training. And that's just where it's so situational.
Yeah. I know a handful of like the well-known sub-max training coaches. They don't really believe much in tapers, because I think for some people, it's just about fatigue management the entire training cycle, right? So like they're not really putting too much stock in even the idea that you can functionally overreach. Simply you get stronger, and then you feel good on meet day because you've been balancing your fatigue the whole time.
Yeah, and I think there's something to say about that, but I also, like, I don't want to be too caught up on one side of the spectrum saying, like, you're going to get, 50 kilos out of the taper and you're not going to get anything out of the taper. It's really just, again, completely situational. If you do a really good job of managing a athlete's fatigue on a week-to-week basis, they're probably going to make good progress, assuming they have all their ducks in a row. They're probably going to make good progress each week, and then that will lead them into the meet, and then they have a monster PR total. Or if, fatigue is something that's harder to manage on your end as a coach or on their end as an athlete, they have a lot of stuff going on. It's a hard time in their life, whatever. And they start to feel more shot and more beat up and their performance starts to dip. You could probably assume that giving them a taper is going to squeeze more out of them. And again, I just think that most answers to certain questions lie somewhere in the middle between like both polar ends. And that's why I just am not super polar ended on like this topic, like many others.
Yeah. I mean, I also think with peaking, I think a lot of it has to also be with managing expectations for bigger meets. Like for example, like at nationals, like there were some people that I thought that the peak went really, really well. But I think one thing that didn't really get kind of factor into the calculus of things is like that nationals is a huge event and you're going to see all of your friends there and you're going to see everyone that you looked up to. And that could potentially have a negative effect on your stress levels. Like, you know, the first time I went to nationals, I met a lot of people that I really looked up to. And I like, you know, and I think that is something that a lot of people don't really consider too much. Like when you go to New York, when like New York State championships, regional meets, national meets, or even higher than that, there needs to be a level of, hey, like this is what you're probably going to go through. And like, this is also something that you need to watch out for and really prioritize yourself and your own mental state with how you deal with it, you know?
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of people expect a lot out of like, they get to their first nationals and as a coach, you can do everything you can, but like personality does play a lot into it. And I have definitely had athletes that are like, yo man, like I'm going to go to the venue and I'm going to hang out with all these people. And I'm like, no, like go to your room and like, just sit by yourself and like, just stare in the corner of the wall. Cause like, you're going to talk too much and you're going to get super amped up from all the loud noises. And then you're going to wake up tomorrow on meet day and you're going to feel super tired and like groggy and you're not going to know why, but I'm going to know why. And it was because you like went and your heart rate spiked when you saw like, you know, Mike T or something. And like you got super amped up for that. And like that all obviously plays a role into that.
Yeah.
So
my heart rate spiked when I got a photo of his biceps or something like that. You know what I mean? I think a couple of the MoC boys were trying to take a photo of him and like sending it out to everyone else. And that's stressful as well. Trying to get a sneak photo of Mike T.
oh man, that bald head is just so smooth.
Yeah.
But it's like, what are you really there for? Are you there for a good performance, or are you there to like make it a social event? And I think sometimes people try to balance both, but they don't. I think a lot of times people might not always completely grasp the idea that nationals is a huge deal, and you know the performance anxiety can be significantly higher at nationals than other events for sure.
Yeah. One thing I'm really trying to do for any of my lifters who I think have like a shot at a nationals qualifier is making them do a meet that's not in Brooklyn or like, you know, around their friends. Cause I think it's when you do a local meet, peaks are like maintaining peak stakes are a little easier because you're not adding in the stress of travel. You're not adding in the stress of like warming up in a gym you've never seen, or even just like getting there or figuring out your food or sleeping in a hotel or things like that, right?
Like flying. Like flying. For example, like, you know, people like, you know, never fly before and then suddenly you fly 10 hours and then you're just like, all right, now go fucking PR. Are we not supposed to curse on this thing?
I mean, it's people know better.
That's true.
Yeah. So I think like, getting the best meet day performance out of someone is like more than programming, right? Like it's like, that's where coaching is different than programming. Like you can send someone a spreadsheet and they can get stronger, but like mind state preparation, like make sure people are actually ready to execute on game day for like the 3 or 4 hours that they're like warming up and competing. Like that's definitely the hard part.
Yeah. And I think athletes need to consider the personality of their coaches. And is that personality the personality you want next to you? Like, for example, like I typically don't do very well with lifters who need a lot of external motivation, right? Like I'm never going to be the coach that's going to like rub baby powder in the back of your head and like put my forehead on your forehead and like, you know, be like, you better get this lift. Like I'm never going to be that coach. And so a lot of times like athletes need to measure not only the coach's success with other athletes, but also measure the success of the coach being in their corner and whether they would enjoy that level of not hype or hype for themselves as well.
Yeah. I think probably as handlers, the three of us are pretty laid back, right?
Yeah.
Like more or less it's like, let's get you warmed up. Let's make sure you're hydrated and fed. But
Yeah.
like, I'm not out there slapping backs. Like I don't really give a lot of active cueing on the platform because like if you couldn't figure it out in training, you're not going to learn it on a meet day.
Yeah. Actually, there was one funny thing about Nikhil and I handling at nationals. There was one guy who was amped up like crazy, and he looked at both of us and he was like, "You guys aren't as amped up enough," or something like that.
Yeah.
And we both kind of like looked at each other.
It's like, "Come on, this is nationals!" And he's like freaking out, yelling at his lifter. And I'm like, "Dog, slow down."
And I'm just like, whatever, man.
Sounds like it was his first nationals.
Maybe. I've never seen him before, but
or his lifters. It was a Sunday, right? It must have been the 84 plus session.
Right. And like, he did a great job. I mean, I'm not hating on him. He did a great job with his athlete, and
I think that's where personalities come into play, right? Like where peaks and personalities, like it's not, I don't know. I think more and more that like training and peaking is not really like a mechanical input output of like, here's training volume, you adapt, and like we can move on. Like you could give someone the same training program when they're in two different states of life, and they'll have two vastly different like responses to it too, right? So like, I think like when it comes to, like peaking and meet day, like don't necessarily assume that because something worked previously that it will work again. Like consider all the factors that went into it, like what your block previously looked like what you're doing now. If you're moving at the same time that you're peaking for a meet, chances are heavy triples are going to feel extra taxing because like you've been like packing boxes and dealing with like stress of like moving.
But then you're like, wait, like I didn't do anything except for move my entire like life.
Yeah, I definitely agree there. There's like just a lot to kind of take into consideration, and to, I think going any further into like situationals, I think we came in here as talking about peaking in a general sense, but there's a lot of specifics that go into it, and that's why I think more people need good coaches and need to just not follow, whatever advice they hear on the internet from some coach talking about a situation that is near perfect.
What are you talking about, man? This is Matt's way of being like, shut the fuck up and let's go on to wrap this up.
It's true.
No, that's not true.
That was true.
Oh, it sounded true.
It's very true.
No.
All right. So like, I guess we'll do one of the questions on the Facebook group.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to address Sam's question because Ray's not training tomorrow, so we're going to ignore Ray's question.
It's only fair.
I also think that, like, talking about athlete circumstance, Ray loves it when, like, essentially
you have to neg him.
Yeah, you got to neg him. He loves being ignored and told that he's never going to amount to anything, and then he ends up amounting to something great. So, actually, I probably shouldn't have said that. But.
No, it's all right. Ray's a good lifter. We just got to heckle him a little.
Yeah, he's a good lifter. Oh, no, I'm perfectly happy with saying that, like, Ray likes to be negged. I don't think it's good for me to say something good about Ray.
Oh, I see.
For him to see it. So if you're seeing this, Ray, I'm sorry. Sorry I said something good about you.
Yeah, but Ray's question was, is getting jacked important? I was like, the answer is yes.
Yeah.
Rebecca asks, how bad should you feel? What is the line between good peaking and injury? And then Sam follows up, I know we're tired and sometimes not hitting our max numbers, but how do we know if we're working too hard? So I think that's a good question, right? Like, the last few weeks of training will probably be hard. How do you know if you need to flag something with your coach, right? Like, how do you know if a week of regression on either your comp lift or like a supplemental lift is okay? And of course, I guess the last question is like, where's the line between I'm beat up and fatigued and I am at the risk of injury?
Yeah. I guess like let's you guys want to focus on that last question. Just be like, how, like, what is the difference between pushing yourself to an injury or pushing yourself for the sake of progression?
Yeah,
I think that's fair.
Right. Because I think that's what like got the most like likes or whatever the case is, and like Clinton also like kind of like doubled down on that, and a couple of other people did. So like I mean, pardon me if I'm mistaken, but I think the biggest thing that people want to hear us talk about is, do we push or do we not push? And in what situations do we push? What situations do we not push?
Totally. So my take on it is generally speaking, people don't know that they're about to be injured in a non-peak state if they get injured, right? Like if someone feels like something in their back in a squat, or does their develop knee tendonitis or elbow aches, there wasn't usually like a leading factor to it. Like it kind of just crept up on you through some sort of technical failure that you repeated, or just like too much loading too quickly. So I don't really know that you can ever tell in a peak state that you're at the risk of injury. If you're feeling general fatigue, which I'll kind of define as like kind of tired, but you're still progressing on your main lifts, like you continue to execute at a high degree when it comes to like your intensity work, it's probably a successful peak, right? So I give a lot of my lifters for like 2 or 3 weeks leading into a meet, what I'll typically do is like a single out of 8, a triple out of 9, and then percentage-based work. So like 3x5 at 78%. And we might repeat that for 2 or 3 weeks just because they can push those singles and triples. If someone sends me a weekly check-in like, hey, I was feeling kind of tired, but I got in the gym and wow, I added 2 kilos to my single, like
that's great.
That is where we want to be. We're walking that line of fatigue management and like actual like strength realization, right? So I don't really know that you can predict injury in a peak any better than you can predict injury outside one, short of the obvious things of you've got a hip shift, you're cocking your wrist back really hard in your squats, and now your wrists start to get achy, right? Like those are just things that happen. But or inappropriately adding load too quickly, right? So if somehow you're getting really strong really quickly, or if like, I mean, we wouldn't do this, but like some coaches would be adding literally 1 or 2 sets per week for like 2 or 3 weeks at a time, right? So like 5x5 on squat, next week 6x5, next week 7x5, right? Like,
Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Or whatever, or taping the reps down. But like a unit of stress is like 1 set. Like the amount of reps you do is kind of like based on the phase you're in. So like if you're adding a set per week, that could be inappropriately fast loading. So I think it's up to the coach to not be super ambitious about pushing volume and like not getting too greedy. But I don't know. Do either of you guys feel like you can tell when a peak will lead to injury?
You want me to take the floor first?
Go for it,
please.
So yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with the idea that other than like inherent movement discrepancies, you're never like, if you don't ever want to ride the line of injury, like don't get under a barbell. Like that's kind of just the way that it is. Like strength training can be dangerous.
This is how we make money, dude. Like shut the fuck up.
Like it can get you hurt. And I think that's just something that you got to kind of accept. Now, obviously we do everything we can possibly can do to keep you away from that in terms of just like tissue damage or like joint health going too far, too quickly, or anything like that. Like you said, if somebody is really ambitious about volume and maybe doesn't know their athlete or is kind of taking like the calculated risk, you can maybe predict that some sort of overuse injuries might start to creep up on you. The main thing that I look for to know that like, hey, the amount of volume that we're doing or like the amount of work total that we're doing isn't too much or is too much is like that one day of the week that I tell you about that I prioritize. If that day is tanking along with the other days, then I know like, okay, we probably need to manipulate something throughout the rest of the week. Generally, when it comes to like training, I think most of us adopt more than 1 time a week frequency for most people on all 3 lifts. And depending on which one it is, I'll kind of wave the loading throughout the week, maybe have like a higher volume day in the beginning of the week, a lower volume day in the middle of the week, and then like a moderate volume, higher intensity day at the end of the week. And that's that day that I'm talking about. If that day tanks and the rest of them aren't doing well, okay, we know we're probably just leaking too much out of our like recovery. So what I will do there is slash some work in the beginning of the week just to keep that day as like the priority day. If they're training all the other days and they're not doing amazing and they're not dropping like massive amounts of like kilos or percentages of their max like off that day because they're so fatigued. But that last day that I'm looking for to prioritize is doing really well, then like I'm kind of okay with where they're at. That day is the biggest teller of like their progress. So if that day's going well, I'm okay. If that day's going terrible and the rest of them are as well, okay, we're probably doing a little too much.
Excellent.
Anything to add?
I think the only thing to add here is that like the responsibility of the athlete is to communicate, and the responsibility of the coach is to make good decisions.
Yeah.
Right? If the athlete has like stalled out for 3 weeks on end, and the coach is just like, like see if you can beat your week after 3 or 4 weeks of stalling, that's a tough position to put the athlete in, because at that point you're just like, hey, are you going to perform or not perform? And then the athlete's going to push it as hard as they possibly can. I think it's just a matter of just like always staying on top of communication as the athlete, and always trying to make the slightly more conservative decision as a coach. Outside of that, like I agree with you guys. I mean, any athletic pursuit is always going to have some sort of risk of injury. I do think that most of the time athletes shouldn't necessarily push past a certain like mental or physical limit if it isn't for some sort of very important competition for themselves. I think that for myself, for example, if I'm going to a local meet and I'm already I know I can qualify for nationals, and I felt like things were getting really intense, I probably would hold back. And I probably would just trust the peak and trust the process and try to stay within my RPs as much as I possibly can. But I gotta say, like, if this was coming up at the nationals or the Arnolds, for example, like I probably would push myself a little bit harder. So I think pushing yourself past a certain point all has to do with how important something is to you, and also has to do with like how confident you are in your technique heuristic. Like if you're staying within like 85 to 90% technique, then I think you're generally good to go. But if you're letting if you're lifting the weight by any means possible, knowing you have a hip shift, or knowing that like, maybe that's not your weight and that you're risking things, then like, of course that's going to increase your risk of injury. But I've seen people go both ways and have mixed results. I can personally say that most of the injuries that I've sustained were injuries that manifested a day after I felt great, or manifested during a workout session that otherwise I was feeling awesome with. Like I felt a pop in my back while squatting, and it was a PR pause squat, and I felt that the technique was on point. I felt everything was very solid. And I just couldn't predict. I couldn't see it coming down the line that my back was going to give out. My best advice is really just listen to the variables, ask yourself if it's worth pushing, and try to stay on the conservative side when things feel a little off.
Yeah.
About it.
I kind of want to add to that too, like something that you said, like when things are feeling a little off or whatever, be a little more conservative. But maybe if you're closer to like a more important competition, like push it a little bit more. A lot of times often I feel that like athletes who do that, who like push through like the weirdness and just like the really rough days, like, and they really just go pedal to the metal. A lot of times, I'm not going to say all the time because never say never, but there's a lot of times where the people who do that end up having really shitty days when it comes to meet day, just because they kind of had like that sacrifice to win kind of, mental cap on, and they ended up sacrificing but not winning just because they pushed too hard. And usually those people end up kind of accruing like whatever sort of overuse injuries, or maybe even like an acute injury, like maybe you had said with popping your back or something like that. And that's just kind of something I wanted to add in for, the people listening. Keep in mind.
Yeah, I think like just probably the last bit to add to that is, if you find yourself relying a lot of external hype, like you need music, you need people yelling at you, you need ammonia, you're probably looking for ways to push harder than your body is ready to push, right? So like, I think speaking from my own like meets where I do better in the gym, or meets where after I perform, I start to feel really achy, it's because I push that peak really aggressively with music, ammonia, try to really chip my 3 at 9 or like my single at 8. I try to push that too hard, expecting that every week was supposed to be like a banner PR week. And so like, I wouldn't say don't bring in external hype, but like also make sure that you're not treating every training session like a all out meet day, right? Like you should be following your RPEs. You should be listening to your body and like getting the feedback and like not being totally stupid, right?
Yeah.
Like you have a meet day and you've got 20 weeks or more leading into it. Like don't treat every training session like it's your last one.
It's control aggression. And, I think one of our coaches, Sarah Cascarino, posted this on her Instagram, but I'm totally going to bastardize this quote. But I think it's something that goes along the lines of, if you're trying to squeeze a rock to get juice out of that rock and then you finally get something, chances are it's going to be your own blood coming out. So like that kind of goes into like the whole peaking and pushing yourself strategy where like, you're going to squeeze so hard thinking that something's going to come out of it, but really what's going to come out of it is your own cost, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I think that's a good wrap up on that question.
Sure. Cool. This was fun.
This was fun. I want to do it again. And I very rarely ever say that. So.
That's true. That's what he told Kaylee on their first date too.
Yeah. Hey, like I want to do this at least one more time.
Personally, I hated it, and I'm not interested in this anymore. So.
Okay. Cool. Well, that was that. Episode 1, season finale.
Yeah. Pilot and season ending.
Yeah.
None of us die in the end. But I was hoping that
This might get picked up by HBO.
Yeah.
That'd be cool.
HBO, like HBO 5 or something like that.
Yeah.
Stars Ultimate.
Stars only. Well, all right. Well, Matthew, I hope you have a great trip back up to Vermont.
Thank you, sir. I hope you have a nice trip back to like 2 blocks to your house.
Thank you.
Same to you, Nikhil.
Thanks.
And Nikhil's driving to Long Island.
Oof, you better watch it, bro.
Bro, you don't even know. It's already dark outside. It might take me 6 hours.
Bro.
A lot of transplants around,
I hate that.
Shut up.
Just saying, there's a lot of out-of-state license plates, and they like to drive a little bit differently. So
yeah,
all right, well,
it's not safe.
As they say in Italy, arrivederci.
I hate that.
Arrabbiata. I'll see you guys later.
All right, later.
See ya.